have, as I said, a special guest today, Dr. Sharif, joining us all the way from the other side of the country on the East Coast. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Sharif. How are you doing today?
Wa alaikum assalam. Alhamdulillah, I'm doing fine. How are you, Rashad?
Alhamdulillah, I'm doing excellent. And I can't start these conversations these days without asking, how are you guys doing out there with everything around COVID-19? And Charlie, you and your family are doing okay?
Yeah, alhamdulillah, hunkering down like everyone else, but it's not
Hmm.
been too bad so far. And I'm in Boston, not New York City, so that's also something to be thankful for. May Allah make it easy for our brothers and sisters and everybody actually who's in New York and anyone around the world who's suffering from this virus, either directly by being sick or many of the, sort of a lot of the fallout from it too.
Hmm.
Is terrible for a lot of people in terms of economics and just loss in income, jobs, and so forth. So we pray that Allah make it easy,
Absolutely.
inshallah, and give us quick relief as a global community,
Absolutely.
inshallah.
I mean, yeah, I appreciate that. And I've shared now an intro for the listeners, and so everyone will have your kind of more formal intro. But I thought I'd ask you, as someone myself who also did an undergraduate in Arabic language, what sparked your interest in Arabic language, and what sparked your interest or continued that through your academic career to this point?
Yeah, so I studied at Georgetown University back in the early 90s as an undergraduate, and I'm a language lover at heart. I really love languages. And when I went to Georgetown, I realized that it had one of the best Arabic programs in the country, and I didn't know any Arabic at the time. And so I decided to take advantage of the program. And so I majored in Arabic as an undergrad and also uh, double minored in Arab studies and in history. And I realized from an early age that I really liked to study and learn and also to teach. And also during those years became very interested in Islam and Islamic studies. And so obviously that dovetailed very nicely with an Arabic degree. And so after graduating, I spent a year in Cairo studying Arabic intensively at the AUC, the American University of Cairo. And then I came back and worked for a couple of years in Washington, D.C., and then decided to go to graduate school in Islamic studies, which I did at McGill University in Montreal, where I
Hmm.
did my master's and then PhD eventually. And so, I kind of, decided to merge my love of language and sort of culture with also my passion for and love of Islam and learning about Islam and Islamic also history and culture and various aspects of society as well as the religion,
Sure.
and tried to sort of put all that together in terms of a career where I can teach and continue to learn about the things that I love. So
That's fascinating, and I'm so happy to have this opportunity to connect with you. And I hope that we'll be diving into the conversation about Project 100. But
mhm.
just before we make that shift and talk about the series that you'll be teaching for Project 100, which itself is, I think, going to be very interesting. I have a ton of questions about this title of Islam and the Modern Worldview, but I thought I'd also take a moment and ask you a little bit about your sort of, I don't know if it's called if it's your PhD dissertation, but I know you have this book published by Brill titled Ibn Taymiyyah on Reason and Revelation, a study guide, a study of, if I'm not mispronouncing, I don't have the Arabic in front of me, but ta'arud wa al-aql wal-naql.
Yes, right. Dar taharud al-aql wal-naql. Exactly.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Okay,
so
so
that's
tell me a
that.
little bit of, yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, so that started out as my PhD dissertation at McGill, which I finished in 2013, and then since that time I've been working on kind of uh, um, uh, turning it into a book, which just came out this past December from Brill in the Netherlands. And basically, what I'm doing in there, it's I've always been interested in the topic of reason and revelation, sort of on a macro level, and I've looked at
Hmm.
various manifestations of that relationship and that tension sometimes in usul al-fiqh, in tafsir, in different
Hmm.
aspects of the Islamic tradition. And this particular project looks at it in terms of theology and philosophy. So Ibn Taymiyyah wrote a 10-volume work called Dar Ta'arud al-Aql wal-Naql, which basically means refutation of the contradiction of reason and revelation. And in there, he's trying to prove the point that there can be no sort of authentic or actual contradiction between true reason and authentic revelation properly understood. So he says if you ever think there's a contradiction between what reason tells us and what revelation tells us, revelation meaning the Quran and the Sunnah, authenticated Sunnah, then either you have misunderstood revelation, or, and this is more pertinent for his work and for my project, you've misappropriated reason. In other words, you're
Mm-hmm.
bringing to the table a notion of reason which is actually faulty, or that is pre-committed to certain presuppositions that don't necessarily hold up, or that we don't need to take on board as Muslims, right? And you're perceiving a conflict, and it's because either you're misunderstanding revelation or you're misunderstanding what reason is actually saying, right? What you think is rational actually isn't, or what
Mm-hmm.
you think is a kind of product of reason or just pure rational thought actually isn't. There are hidden assumptions in there that you're not seeing, and those hidden assumptions, which are questionable, are what is causing the alleged contradiction. So that's kind of his overall point. And I was interested, I mean, when I saw the work, I decided to kind of study it, not primarily because I wanted to become an Ibn Taymiyyah specialist, but because I'm interested in that particular topic. And I said, look, he's written 10 volumes on it, and he comes rather late, in sort of classical Islamic thought. So he's responding to the entire kind of philosophical tradition that had been developed before him, the Falasifa and also the Mutakallimin, so the kind of scholastic theologians. He's kind of engaging with this entire pretty rich tradition of thought that has developed by that point. And I said, well, he must be saying something interesting in there, so let me try to find out, what it is. And also, I mean, I clearly am not interested in this topic for purely academic reasons,
Mm-hmm.
academic meant here in the pejorative sense. I think it's a really important topic that sort of spans time and place, and that manifests itself in different ways, in different contexts. And I think that for us as Muslims in the modern world, and this kind of takes us into the heart of the course and the whole issue of Islam and modernity. For us as Muslims
Mm-hmm.
in the modern world, we live as people who believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, believe in God, we believe in revelation, right? And we live in the midst of this kind of self-styled age of reason, which the modern world is, as of the Enlightenment. Um, and uh, and so, how do we kind of navigate the inevitable tensions and incongruences that come up when you're living in a time period that doesn't even recognize revelation as
Mm-hmm.
valid? A valid source of knowledge, a valid source of, knowledge about the world, about morals and ethics, or about anything, right? And all claims that are made in one way or another in the name of reason, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if there were tensions back in the Middle Ages when everybody accepted the existence of God and everybody accepted revelation, and you still had tensions, what about when you're living in an age where revelation is just thrown out the window altogether, and you're trying to navigate it as a believer who not only holds to revelation, but for whom revelation is actually central and primary, right?
Mm-hmm.
Allahu ya'lamu wa
And
antum la ta'lamun. Allah knows and you don't know. That's a pretty substantial statement.
mm-hmm. That's fascinating, and I appreciate how these two subjects connect now. And I'm looking forward to this session itself. I'm going to link to everybody, MuslimAmericanSociety.org/Project 100, along with this podcast, so they can learn more about this project. It's coming up. The application deadline is this weekend, so as soon as you hear this podcast, you'll have an opportunity to go online and apply for this program. But I wanted to pick a few points that you just mentioned here to understand better. So you're going to be teaching. Let's take one quick step back, and you'll be teaching one of these sections or one of these sessions. Not one session. You'll be teaching a series of sessions around this topic of Islam and the modern worldview. So maybe give us just a little quick overview of how this project came about, and what how you'll be addressing this over these couple of weeks.
Yeah, so Project 100 as a whole is a project which aims to identify 100 really serious, dedicated students of knowledge and serious activists to kind of spend 4 weeks attending a program twice a week for 2 hours each time and really digging deep into some critical issues in order to inform our approach to Islam and our activism surrounding Islam. So there are several components of the program, and one of those components is the one that I will be teaching, inshallah, which is called Islam and Modernity. Well, Navigating Paradigms, Islam and the Modern Worldview is sort of the full title. That'll
Hmm.
be every session, there'll be probably maybe 40 minutes on that, 30, 40 minutes. And then Dr. Wa'il Hamza will be teaching a segment which involves doing a deep dive into the seerah and going very deep, sounding the depths of the seerah and sort of bringing out lessons for us to apply in our circumstances. And then there'll be a third component that is miscellaneous rotating topics, which can be mental health, spirituality, political activism, and other such topics. And then there'll be breakout groups for people to come together uh, and interact with each other in a more personal level about the material and about their lives and build relationships that way. So that's sort of an overview of the program. And my specific piece of that, again, is this question of Islam and modernity, or Islam in the modern worldview.
Hmm.
So I guess I could
And
give,
so,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
yeah, and before exactly, I really appreciate that overview. This is, I think, you mentioned a couple of things here that I'm curious to pick at your, because I think you were specifically using words that you wanted to capture an idea. So you mentioned something here about the self-styled age of reason. So tell me why you chose to refer it to that way. Because today, for example, I have a lot. I try to have a lot of conversations with friends, with family. There are a handful of people that appreciate this subject, or want to spend time talking about religion from a worldview perspective or a philosophical perspective. And so, in these conversations, the age of reason is it's just accepted as that, as though we've moved past an age of you know, the age of superstition, the age of religion, and now we're in the age of reason. Maybe you can, break that definition of self-styled age of reason that you mentioned.
Well, yeah, I mean, the characterization you just gave is sort of the dominant, I would say, everyday conception of what modernity is all about, right? That through the scientific revolution in well, starting in the 17th century, late 17th century, and then the Enlightenment of the 18th century, mankind has sort of grown up. We've grown out of superstition slash religion, and of course, superstition and religion are linked. Religion is reduced to a kind of form of superstition, and we've come into our own as kind of rationally autonomous human beings who henceforth only take kind of reason as our guide for what is true, what is real, what is right and wrong, what life is all about, what we should be doing here on this planet, and so forth. Right. So that's kind of the everyday. Now, obviously, anyone who knows anything about Islam or has any level of commitment to Islam realizes that this is radically different from our starting point. Right. Again, we start with Allah Subhanahu wa Taala as the central reality, without which nothing could exist, right? If everything is contingent except for Allah Subhanahu wa Taala, who is the necessary existence. This is a fundamental point of Islamic theology. It's clear in the Quran. It can also be discussed,
Hmm.
rationally, as the theologians have done, right? And we also have, in addition to just a kind of generic belief in God, we also believe in, I mean, the Shahada, La ilaha illallah, Muhammadun
Hmm.
Rasulullah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? So that a particular man, Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, was sent as a messenger of Allah with a revelation from God in the form of a discrete book, the Quran, and
Hmm.
exemplified by his Sunnah. So this commits us to a very different worldview, if I can use that term altogether, right? We believe
Hmm.
that in addition to reason and in addition to sort of empirical science, which is what the modern world kind of limits, I would say,
Hmm.
human knowledge to, right? We believe that in addition to reason, in addition to empirical science, we have another third and very important and very fundamental source of knowledge, which is revelation, right?
Hmm.
And there are many things that we know from revelation that we wouldn't otherwise know. And that's what revelation means. I mean, Allah is revealing to us things that we wouldn't otherwise know, right? Allahu ya'lamu wa antum la ta'lamun. Allah knows and you
Hmm.
don't know. Now, this doesn't mean that revelation, as Ibn Taymiyyah has tried to prove, and I've tried to show in my work on him, it doesn't mean that revelation contradicts reason or tells us things that
Hmm.
are absurd or tells us things that contradict empirical facts that we can verify with certitude, right? But it does
Hmm.
add to that. Not only does it add to our kind of to our stock of knowledge, right, by adding items like about the day of judgment and all these other things, but also, I mean, much deeper than that, it provides a completely different perspective uh, through which we approach the world itself, right? We approach the world as being a creation of God, as being a manifestation of God's names and attributes, of as having purpose, right? مَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. Allah says, I have not created jinn and mankind except to worship me. So we
Hmm.
have a purpose for why we're here. Also, Allah points many almost every page of the Quran, Allah points to the physical universe that science studies, right, as not just brute facts or brute dead material, which is how the scientific worldview conceives of the environment around us, but it points to these things as signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? That the alternation of the night and day and the many processes, wondrous processes that we observe every day in nature and that we are even more aware of because of our modern science, right?
Hmm.
Aware of the complexity, of the beauty, of the interconnectedness. Allah points to these as meaningful signs pointing to a purposeful creator, right?
Hmm.
Not just as, again, dead matter, which is how, again, from the 17th century on, the modern worldview kind of conceives it. Not only that, I mean, Allah tells us, وَإِن مِّن شَيْءٍ إِلَّا يُسَبِّحُ بِحَمْدِهِ. Nothing exists except that it hymns the praises of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? We live as Muslims in a universe where the birds in their chirping are actually making tasbih of Allah, right? Allah says,
Hmm.
وَلَكِنْ لَا تَفْقَهُونَ تَسْبِيحَهُمْ. Everything is making tasbih, but we just don't understand their tasbih, right?
Hmm.
But it's a very different picture of the world than a picture that reduces all of sort of external reality to pure quantity, pure physicality, and pure materiality, right?
Hmm.
And that is sort of the basic premise of the modern worldview. Now, this is very high level, but this type of way of looking at the world, this worldview, right? That's what worldview means, has implications on so many different levels, and it deeply impacts the way we think, even as Muslims in the modern world, because we're bathed in this environment,
Right.
and it's just part of the air that we breathe, right? And so there are many assumptions that we have even as Muslims that are kind of deeply informed by materialistic views of the world, by atheistic or at least agnostic kind of conceptions of the
Right.
world and of the human being and of our place in the world and of the provenance of, say, morals and ethics and all of these things
Hmm.
that we kind of take on board as Muslims just by virtue of existing in the modern world. And in fact, they deeply contradict Islam. They deeply contradict what we actually claim to believe in,
Hmm.
right? And the problem here is that when you take on board contradictory assumptions, I mean, that contradict each other on the deep level, sooner or later, a tension is going to become manifest between them. Sooner or
Right.
later, you're going to run into a contradiction. Sooner or later, you're going to run into irreconcilable
Hmm.
claims that are being put forth. Well, Islam says this, but the modern world says that, whether it's
Right.
modern science, whether it's the modern conception of human freedom or what
Right.
morality is all about, or political, arrangements, any number of levels. You're going to
Hmm.
find a conflict between sort of the going kind of uh, taken for granted assumptions, obvious quote unquote facts
Right.
of that everyone takes for granted, and what we find in the Quran and the Sunnah or the Islamic tradition or whatever.
Hmm.
And this can lead to obviously a lot of internal turmoil and tension, right? Not only do we have trouble explaining Islam, certain aspects of Islam to non-Muslims, but we also have trouble, frankly speaking, explaining it to ourselves as
Hmm.
Muslims, because
Correct.
we too are products of this modern world, and again have taken on many of its basic assumptions. And so questions arise in our mind, right, that rankle the heart. Well, wait a
Hmm.
minute, I'm a Muslim, but it contradicts with this. Is the
Right.
Quran wrong about human origins, for example, right?
Right.
How do I negotiate that tension? You see?
And
So, yeah.
that's a particularly interesting one, and I appreciate that. Forgive me for jumping in here, but I also wanted to get a sense for when you talk about modern worldview. Is a lot of it focused around the scientific conclusions that have been derived, or is it a broader discussion about maybe the political, economic philosophies that exist and what they're based on, morality itself? And I know at the fundamental level, it's this question of the discussion of reason and revelation as well. So when you talk about modern worldview, are you going to be covering a wide variety of those subjects, or focusing on a few particular examples?
Well, the questions are comprehensive.
Hmm.
So, I mean, science is fundamental to the discussion because, again, and we'll get into this in the course, every worldview, and everybody has a worldview, just like everybody
Hmm.
has a language, everybody has a worldview. So we can think of the worldview as kind of a thought language, right?
Hmm.
It's the lens through which we perceive the world. Every human being anywhere on the planet, you know, uh, has a language that they speak. They open their mouth and something comes out, right? That's their
Right.
native language that they've acquired. Similarly, everyone has some type of worldview, even if it's implicit. In other words, what do I mean by that? You have some notion of what exists and what doesn't exist. So what is
Right.
real and not real? I won't give that's ontology. I won't give all of the, technical terms. That'll be part of the course.
Sure.
Everyone has a notion of what knowledge is and what are the sources of knowledge. If someone stands up and says, well, we know X, Y, and Z, okay, well, what are the standards of knowledge in a given society? What do you consider to be knowledge as opposed to mere opinion or belief or supposition or something like that? That's part of
Right.
your worldview. What do you think a human being is, right? Who are we? As, what is man, as Shakespeare would ask? You know,
Hmm.
uh, who are we? Where are we from? Where do we come from? Where are we going, if anywhere? What is our nature? Our actual, true human nature, right? What is it that we should be doing? Those are questions of anthropology, you could say, not in the sense of
Hmm.
the kind of discipline of anthropology, but just anthropos, meaning an insan, the human being. Okay,
Hmm.
then yes, you have questions of morals and ethics. So, as human beings, no one denies that we exist as moral creatures, right? We have a sense of right and wrong, and we hold each other to account for actions. So, what constitutes moral action?
Hmm.
Where do I derive my sense of morality from, right? How do I acquire that? How do I live, right? How does a human being live ultimately in the world? These are age-old questions. I mean, asked by the Greeks, asked by every culture, has
Hmm.
asked these questions on one level. They're fundamental human questions. And then after that, you have the question of, okay, that's me as an individual, but then human beings come together as a society,
Hmm.
right? Societies have to be run through a polity, and the polity is governed by a law. So where does that law come from? What is the source of legitimate law that we can all sort of
Hmm.
accept and say, yes, this is a just law that we agree should be obeyed, right? What is the nature of the kind of political system that brings people together in larger collectivities beyond the individual and the family level, right?
Right.
And what are the norms that should govern sort of a political arrangement, right? These are all parts of the worldview. And then the question of teleology or purpose: is there a
Hmm.
purpose in our lives, human lives? I mean, an objective purpose, right? Are we here for some objective reason, or are we just
Right.
here to kind of project our own sort of self-generated, meaning onto the universe and purpose onto it? Okay.
Right.
Uh, and then the final question that comes into a worldview, which is important, is the question of aesthetics, right?
Hmm.
Beauty. What do we consider to be beautiful, right?
Hmm.
And I always tell students that if you look at the art that is produced by any culture, you can tell a lot about the heart
Hmm.
and soul and the worldview and the overall kind of positioning and ethos of that culture by looking at its art, because that's a reflection of the spirit of that culture. So Islamic art is extremely important to look at because it says a lot about who we are as Muslims. And you can look at Western art from the Middle Ages until what passes as art today, Okay, that I'm obviously making a judgment statement there, but I mean to.
Right.
Okay, and you can tell a lot about what is happening in Western culture in each and every age by looking at the art that's produced, the architecture, what's considered
Hmm.
beautiful and aesthetically pleasing in each age. So, this is also part of it. So the worldview is a comprehensive thing. It is a global set of, things that you consider to be true and valuable about existence, about the world, and how you would answer all of those different questions. That's what a person's worldview is, right?
Hmm.
And my premise in this course is that as Muslims, we have a worldview, and it's a robust worldview. It's a rich
Hmm.
worldview. It's very well articulated and thought out. It's very comprehensive. It's very consistent. It's persuasive. It answers all of these questions in sort of the deepest possible manner. It's very satisfying. Okay, and we also live again in a world in the modern age, a world that is not of our own making. Right? We live in a
Hmm.
world where the dominant culture is not, was not derived from Muslim civilization or Islamic sources. That civilization also has a worldview. And on all of the levels that we just mentioned, what exists, how do we know, who are we as humans, how should we act, law, politics,
Hmm.
aesthetics, teleology, all of these points, it also has very specific answers to these questions. And in
Hmm.
most cases, the answers are very different from what our answers are. So it's actually a very different
Hmm.
worldview. Now, it doesn't mean that it's contradictory in every respect, or that we can't live in it, or that we can't interact with it. Of course not, right? But the founding assumptions are very different. And a lot of times, again, conflicts manifest themselves on the surface. And unless you understand the deep roots of where the incongruence lies, you will not be able to adequately solve those conflicts. You will either be
Hmm.
just confused because, all right, Islam says this, and the modern whatever paradigm says that, and they just are kind of talking past each other, and I don't know how to negotiate that, right?
Hmm.
Or you will, and this often happens too, you will sort of, because you're not taught to perceive and to analyze and to critique the deeper assumptions, you will kind of, despite yourself, concede many of the premises of the other worldview, in this case, the modern sort of secular worldview, and then you will try
Hmm.
to justify or interpret Islam on the basis of those. Do you see what I'm
Hmm.
saying? So Islam is true and right and good because it's all about, freedom, for example, the modern
Right.
radical sort of notion of radical autonomy, which we can talk about. Or Islam is
Hmm.
is redeemable because it's, completely agrees with modern science and never conflicts with it, or
Correct.
what have you, right? And first of
Yeah.
all, this is not true. Second of all, you're never going to win. I always tell students, by playing on someone else's terms, okay?
Right.
Because you're taking the other side's assumptions, so to speak, or the assumptions of the other paradigm. I don't want to again talk about it as an oppositional thing, because
Sure.
this shouldn't be our attitude. But you take the assumptions of the other paradigm and you try to justify your own beliefs and thoughts and commitments in terms of that. And it's never going to work because it's not honest. And I don't mean that the person is being dishonest by saying that, but it's kind of, you're shooting in the wrong place, right?
Right.
And sooner or later the deficiencies of that approach will become apparent, because you will reach a point where something will come up in Islam where you simply will not be able to plausibly reduce it to some element of the other paradigm, because that's not what
Correct.
Islam is all about to begin with, right? So you can go
Yeah.
so far in, justifying X, Y, or Z as a question of freedom, or a question of autonomy, or a question of whatever else, it is. But something's going to come up where no, like there's just an impasse and you cannot plausibly interpret it in
Hmm.
those terms. And then you're left high and dry because you've conceded so many assumptions to the other paradigm. You have nothing left on your own side. And now you can't,
Yes.
sort of solve this issue that's come up, that won't let itself be, recast in terms of this other thing. And then you realize that your approach has just been wrong from the beginning.
Right.
So we want to get the approach
I
right
can't.
from the start so that
Yeah.
we don't end up there. Yeah.
So I have to ask because exactly what you just described is exactly the experience I've had. There's a handful of people that I've had serious intellectual conversations about subjects like this. It usually starts off with something very, very direct or simple, maybe like you said, human origins or other types of kind of modern findings in science that perceivably or possibly are they are perceived to be at odds with the classic interpretation, or not even a classic interpretation, maybe just a modern interpretation. Muslims might say this today, and it's at odds with some data that we're finding. I've actually gone through this exact experience. I found that in the beginning, I was spending my time focused on the ideas that were coming from that other paradigm without actually having dissected for myself or with the other person what those underlying assumptions were.
Mm-hmm.
And only recently have I started to realize, even for myself, to be able to have this conversation, I have to first understand what are all the underpinnings of this worldview before we can build on top of why they think that particular idea is true or not true. The human origin one is a conversation I've had for almost a decade with someone in particular, and I got to exactly that point. We could not make progress because we actually weren't able to. We were not under identifying what the basis of this understanding actually was. So I love the way you laid out sort of this approach. And if I could ask, maybe as a closing statement or a closing idea, I'm curious to know for the individual approaching this course. To me, it doesn't sound like it's a course designed for someone who just wants, some entertainment or edutainment, so to speak, infotainment in a sense, something that they're just going to show up and listen to something and feel maybe motivated by it. So it's definitely for someone who's serious and is ready to get into a rigorous program. The other question I have is, it also doesn't seem from what you're describing that this is a course designed to just explain, to give answers. Okay, on this subject, this is the answer. Islam says this, the other worldview says this, therefore Islam is right because of this. It seems to be going a layer deeper than that. And maybe you can sort of tell me if those are my correct assumptions, and if there are other things that someone should know for someone who's applying, what they can expect and what they can expect to walk away with.
Good. Yeah, thank you for the question. So I agree with you that it's not meant for, edutainment. And I don't think it will be that, because I think that these questions are existential questions for almost anybody who's thinking, in the modern world. I always say, if
Hmm.
someone grows up in the modern world and has never had a doubt about anything in Islam, or never had a problem with anything in it, then then they're not thinking. I mean, quite frankly, because it's just not possible to live in this world and be aware of what's going on around you, and what's being said. Um, Unless you're just completely oblivious to it, you're going to have at some point, well, wait a minute, this doesn't seem congruent, and how do I? Now, it doesn't mean it has to be an existential crisis for you, but I would,
Hmm.
I would guess that everybody out there, in modern America, has on some level or another felt this tension, or at least understands the importance of it. So I hope that the subject will be, I hope that it will be immediately obvious as to why this is a relevant topic. In terms of what someone can come away with, yes, it's not going to be a question of, okay, here's a hot button issue X, and here's sort of the 2-minute response to it. Right? We need to have the
Hmm.
2-minute response. We need to have the 10-minute response. We need to have the 30-minute response.
Hmm.
We need to be able to, simplify and kind of package things. But the goal of this course is to go deep, as you said, and to get people to understand what are the origins, what are the deep roots underlying each worldview, right? What are the primary assumptions, and how are those manifested at various levels of the kind of the surface manifestations of the worldview, right? And more
Hmm.
than anything, it is to, and again, we have a limited time, so we're not going to be able to get into every single issue, and we're not going to be able to, even the issues we get into, we won't be able to completely excavate them and sort of treat them in all of the, desired detail and
Sure.
comprehensiveness. But the idea is for people to leave with a sort of a new way of thinking about things, a new way of analyzing things, and new way of asking the relevant questions, right? And I've had students tell me this in the past who have taken similar iterations of this course that I've given locally in the Boston area, right? They say, okay, now we have a whole different way when an issue comes up where there's a conflict or an incongruence. We know now what not to do. You don't just jump and start arguing X, Y, and Z. Rather, you need to ask this question, and that question, right? You know how to go about searching for the answers on a deeper level, on the level where it makes most sense to look for those answers, right? So you start to develop that kind of analytical approach, and I would say the approach where you look deep beyond the surface, right? Allah talks a lot about, you know, um, uh, uh, about the zahir, right? Just the surface manifestations of
Mhm.
things. And we are asked to go beyond that and to understand the reality behind them and to be people of albab, people of deep reflection and
Mhm.
people of deep understanding. Fiqh means deep understanding. Man yuridillahu
Mhm.
bihi khayran yufaqihu fi din. For whoever Allah wants good for, He gives him fiqh, deep understanding in the deen. And the deen here is understood comprehensively, right? It's not just fiqh in the sense of the ahkam of the fiqh. This uh, meaning of fiqh is a particularization that comes about later on. But the original meaning of
Mhm.
fiqh is just deep understanding and includes the entire worldview, if you ask me, right? So the idea is that someone comes away saying, first, I mean, again, and I would say the most important thing that someone will come away with is conflict. A conflict arises. At least you know you don't need to freak out. Okay. You
Mhm.
don't need to be plunged into an existential crisis every time some conflict comes up that looks unresolvable to you, and therefore Islam looks like it's being disproved or undermined in some way or another. Right? You take your breath.
Right.
You say, "Wait a minute. Let me start scratching the surface here. I bet you anything there's something going on at a deeper level that if I just uh, keep digging, I'm going to get
Mhm.
to the heart of this issue and I'm going to see, aha, that's where the conflict really lies. That's where the issue really lies, right? And
Mhm.
the only reason why the modern worldview says this thing, which is conflicting with Islam, is because it starts from premise P. But you know what? I know as a Muslim, I don't even accept that premise to begin with. And I understand why I
Mhm.
don't. And I understand which premise I accept in its place and that's why that premise is actually true. And when I see that, I realize,
Mhm.
okay, that now the tension is solved because I realize that surface level incongruence is just that. It's like a surface manifestation that if I trace it down to its roots and understand the roots, then the issue kind of evaporates on its own, right? And because you've done away with the
Absolutely.
yeah. So I don't know if that made sense.
It does. It absolutely does, and that's a great way to summarize and even wrap up this session. It's been a real pleasure, Dr. Sharif. I am excited myself about this program. I hope to be joining it. A lot of questions I've had throughout my life, as well as conversations I've had with other, of my own peers, other young Muslims. These are questions that come up on a regular basis, and people often are facing that existential crisis that does come about for some people, and in reality some might just ignore it, right? So sometimes it's easier just to avoid thinking about it because it'll be a difficult topic.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm happy to hear there is a way to approach it. There is a way to understand it from a deeper perspective, and it will. If I'm not mistaken, I think this was not something just that will increase us and enrich us intellectually, but personally, I also see this as a way to enrich myself spiritually, and those two for me they go hand in hand.
Of course.
I'm looking forward to, I hope, the opportunity to have more conversations with you. Looking forward to this opportunity to join you in Project 100, and for this particular session on Islam and the modern worldview. So I will be sharing the link out with everyone to join. I will be getting this podcast out to everyone today, and I look forward to being in touch with you as well. Thank you again, Dr.
Thank you
Sharif,
so much.
and thank you for
And if I can actually just
thank,
one small
of
comment on
course.
what you just said, which I think is really critical. You said that, you expect it to be not only intellectually stimulating, but spiritually meaningful. And you kind of presented those as sort of two separate things. And I would like to just say that no, those are actually two sides of the same coin, because at the heart of the matter, our worldview is a a religious worldview, right? I mean, at the very basis of it
Hmm.
is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's our souls, it's worship, it is spirituality, right? I mean, that's it. And
Right.
the main difference between the modern kind of materialistic worldview and any traditional religious worldview, Islam and others, is precisely that point, right? That we live primarily uh, uh, as spiritual beings with a spiritual reality, right? We know that Allah says Allah will not look at your forms and your shapes, but He will look at your heart
Hmm.
and your deeds, right? So, part of recapturing our own worldview is precisely recapturing a fundamentally spiritual groundedness and a fundamentally spiritual orientation to the world, which I started talking about in the beginning. Like for us, the entire universe
Right.
is a spiritual entity. The trees are not just, it's not just dead matter, right? They're making tasbih. They are engaged in worship, right?
Hmm.
Anyway, so yes, spirituality is
That's
is absolutely central to this because it's what our worldview is based on and infused with through and through. And if we miss that, then
mhm.
we've missed the entire point. So,
I love that clarification. Thank you so much for that, especially because I've been, struggling with the proper way to articulate these ideas. And I realized that being born and raised, growing up in this context, call it Western, American, whatever you want to call it, it is, underlying it, its underpinnings, whether it's academic underpinnings and assumptions, they are often, like you said, agnostic or potentially atheistic and mostly secular. And in addition to that, going through the education system, the entire, media environment, everything that we often consume comes with that as well. And so I love this idea, and I'm excited to dive more into it through this session. I hope that you and I will have a chance to continue this conversation. It's a number of areas that I have more questions around, and it'll be, I think, an excellent opportunity. But we'll be
inshallah.
in touch and we'll talk more about that. Jazakallah khair again. Allah bless you and your
Ameen
family
wa
and
iyaakum,
keep you safe,
inshallah.
Dr. Sadiq.
Barakallahu feek. Thank you so
And
much.
assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam.